Welcome everyone. Kia ora, thank you so much for joining our session on how to reach energy users in the residential and commercial sector. I am trying to share my screen and that is hopefully happening. It is part of the Users TCP, or it's called User-Centered Energy System Technology Collaboration Program by IEA, or the International Energy Agency. So Users TCP is the shorthand. And I'm going to need to highlight up front that the Users TCP is functionally and legally autonomous from the IEA Secretariat in Paris. And we have a few objectives for the session. We are hoping to educate you a bit about our research on who the hard-to-reach energy users are in the residential and commercial sectors, and what do we know already after about 18 months of research. We want to explore with you how complex these audiences are and what the barriers are. We would also like to engage with you, getting some feedback of what you know about these audiences that we don't yet, and then we want to do some visioning of where we can go from here to help those who are the hardest to reach in our respective countries, but also globally. So the agenda for the session is I'm going to give a short presentation on behalf of Kira, our US national expert, who, as I said, is on holiday and it's 5 in the morning over there. It was based on our abstract 4-7, and it is with regards to a characterization of the hard to reach that we undertook last year. We are then going to go over to our national experts in the UK, in New Zealand, and in Sweden, who will give some short presentations on some of the main issues that we have encountered in our research, and then we're gonna go on Mentimeter and collect your feedback as well on that. And finally, we want to have an audience discussion where we can actually just have a big talk about the big question, which is how we're going to approach the hard to reach in a post-COVID world, if there is such a thing, particularly seeing that their numbers have increased so massively during this pandemic. And you already know a lot of this housekeeping. The session will be recorded. It would be great if you guys could hop on your screen now, on your where your face is, and go on the 3 dots and actually change your affiliation. Go rename and change your add your affiliation to your name and your country if you can. I just did it myself. That would be great, because we would like to see who is actually joining us, from where, from which countries. Oops. And the Q&A in the chat function, actually, yes, please, if you need to write some questions down to remind yourselves. Otherwise, I would suggest that we have our videos on and our unmute yourself when you want to ask a question or get involved in a discussion, because there's not that many of us, and I think it's a lot more personable that way. I assume you all have the latest Zoom, otherwise you wouldn't be in this breakout room. And then if you could also do something else for me, and that is to open your web browser and keep it open in the background, and please type in menti.com, and then you'll get this code. We will be flashing it up again before we ask questions, but this is how we're going to collect your feedback today in the session. So it's a bit of a live polling function, thanks to the University of Lund. Thank you. Okay, now to get a little bit into our research, I'm going to try not to repeat things that I've already said several times during this conference, but this research came after 8 years research collaboration on behavior change in DSM, where 14 countries were involved, also with the Users TCP, or it was called the DSM program in the past. And we realized towards the last couple of years that there was a very large group of energy users that really wasn't engaged or motivated or targeted well with the various energy efficiency and behavior interventions. And we hypothesized that that was around 1/3 of energy users. And then in our research, particularly the huge literature review that we wrote found that the audience size estimates would suggest that it is closer to 2/3, if not 3/4 of energy users that are actually hard to reach in some way or form. So our definition of hard to reach energy users is very broad on purpose. Most people think of them as low-income households who live in energy poverty, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. Being low income doesn't mean you're necessarily hard to reach or that you're necessarily vulnerable. There's a lot of low income assistance programs out there, but there are a lot of other types of hard to reach or vulnerable households. And then particularly in the commercial sector, most commercial sector groups are actually hard to reach in some way or form. Over 50% of them are renters. There's the split incentive issue with renters and landlords. Then, of course, there is small to medium businesses, which are 97% of all commercial sector activities, and they're regarded as the hardest to reach. There's the least research done on them, and the commercial sector in general is actually not targeted very well because it usually gets conflated with the office sector. The building types and business uses often get conflated into kind of like one amorphous thing, like in the residential sector, and that it's just not targeted enough to really reach those audiences. The reason why we kept this definition so broad is because we wanted to make sure that we capture all those different groups, some of which I've mentioned just before, and then we can prioritize further and actually create more defined, detailed, in-depth definitions for each of the individual groups based on what our participating countries were particularly interested in. We did co-create a shared goal because I strongly believe that the first step to a successful research collaboration is to get your stakeholders together and nut out what actually your common objective and goals are. So we did that in a workshop in the US when we could still travel as part of just following the Becky conference in 2019. And we came up with this shared goal, which all of our countries agreed on. And the thing that made me really happy is that in this Venn diagram, you see that where we all overlap is focus on equity and energy justice, as difficult as it is to achieve, I might add. Here are our very brilliant participants and collaborators. Lots of thanks to all of them. We have 3 financially participating countries in the US, Sweden and New Zealand, and then we have the UK and Canada participating very strongly in kind. And we also got a lot of feedback and input from hard to reach experts in various other countries, for example, with surveys that we did or co-authoring our literature review or other papers with us, or providing case studies for our case study analysis, which we're undertaking in the moment. This is kind of the center of what we are doing, which is a research process that we co-created with our project partners in the US, the Sea Change Institute. We call it the ABCDE Building Blocks of Behavior Change. It looks linear. It is actually not. It's a double loop learning or a open loop learning process. It looks at patterns and the evolution of knowledge. It is based on design thinking, which are the 4 big building blocks on the bottom. But then what is special about it is that it actually connects design thinking with very strong and robust social science methodology in those individual ABCDE building blocks. And there are kind of stop gates between each of these different phases so that you get your stakeholders together and you make sure that you're all still on the same page. So what we have done so far is we spent quite a lot of time on the landscape and stakeholder analyses, really nutting into the why and understanding the wider landscape of what we're working with. We've really delved into defining hard to reach audiences and which target energy saving behaviors actually most apply to them or were done in the literature, which is the A and B of our building blocks. And we are now entering the design phase where we're actually looking at engagement strategies and how the content and delivery of messages and messaging work, what behavioral science is used, etc. Here are some deliverables. I'm not going to go through this too much. The links are going to be up on the website. I do want to point out that the huge beast that we've written, that literature review of over 250 pages with over 1,000 publications, is going to come out soon. Danielle is currently helping me update it with all the COVID-19 data that has changed, of course, since September when we finished the last draft, and we're going to publish it hopefully very soon, next month, if we're lucky. I'm now just going to go very quickly into the hard-to-reach characterization, which was the paper Kira was put in as an extended abstract. It was kind of the document that we started building everything else on. We wanted to develop a framework with our countries for defining and identifying the hard-to-reach audiences, the goals of better engaging them, providing an overview of their definitions and barriers, take stock of how frequently they were mentioned by practitioners and researchers, particularly in our countries, but also around the world, and then assess some preliminary metrics for cross-country transferability of learnings, because that's always the challenge with these cross-country research collaborations. And here is what we did. We started off with a big survey where we got about 100 responses of experts from about 30 countries. We then did in-depth stakeholder interviews with practitioners, NGOs, policymakers, researchers in each of our 5 countries. And then, of course, we also looked at case studies, talked to our networks. Our workshop in the US, our 2-day workshop, really added a lot to this. And then, of course, so did the literature review. And I'm just going to speak to some of the results that we found. Obviously, a lot of hard-to-reach audiences were mentioned in each of our countries, but the ones that came up in all of them, here are just the ones that were actually mentioned by 3 or more countries. The ones that were mentioned the most were, of course, low income, but also renters, which was also the second largest group in our with publications in our literature review. It was the second largest chapter, and then small businesses, which, as I said, are the most common types of business in the world and also the hardest to reach. We also looked at common barriers by country, and obviously competing life priorities were really big, which makes sense when you think that a lot of hard to reach are also vulnerable, and energy efficiency is usually not on top of their mind when especially when they have that heat and heat dilemma, etc. Cost obviously was a big issue, and then trust or mistrust, more like it, was another issue that was mentioned very commonly, particularly in that vulnerable household group, and Kim is going to talk about that more. That was just a network map that we tried to do, where we were looking how the different audiences and barriers were connected. Kind of makes all a lot of sense. Like low income ones, where the biggest barrier was cost. For renters, it was trust and competing priorities, etc. The cross-country metrics that we looked at were access to technology, the various program goals, the age of the population in our countries. All of those were actually very similar across our countries. Where we had some differences were around the policy context. Also, when we did this, I may need to add that the US was under a different government. Sorry, I'm not going to say anything else, but the policy context was quite different then. And then we also looked at the prevalence of different hard-to-reach audiences in the different countries. For example, Sweden is #1 in the world in the lowest energy poverty. So obviously, there was less of a energy poor audience in Sweden than there was, for example, in the UK or in New Zealand. And then the metrics where we found we actually had the least overlap was obviously climatic conditions, because the US is massive and there is lots of different ones, but also Canada and Sweden are a lot colder than New Zealand, which is in the South Pacific, although our houses are so terrible that it is actually colder inside our homes than it is anywhere else, I think, in Canada and Sweden. And also the big difference was the entity who was running the programs. And that is one of the things that we always need to keep reminding ourselves when we're working on the hard to reach, which is who is focusing on the hard to reach, who is funding it, why they're doing it, what are the main motivations. And in the US, a lot of this funding is over $8 billion a year of energy efficiency funding comes via regulated utilities. So a lot of it is done by the utility industry and third-party implementers. In Sweden, a lot more is done by the government and by academics. And as Louise said, for him, actually, some of the hardest to reach groups are the utilities in Sweden. In the UK, it's actually quite a nice collaboration between the charitable sector, between government, between utilities and researchers. And in New Zealand, we're kind of trying to do the same, but it's a bit easier because we're only like 5 people and everyone knows each other. So, but some key findings, obviously I already said the most commonly mentioned audiences were those 3. However, the ones with the highest energy saving potential were quite different. There were high income and high consuming households, the landlords, who are always the hardest to reach, and also building operators in commercial buildings that have a lot of power over energy use. When we looked at non-energy stakeholders who obviously used the hard to reach terminology and defined it a lot more in depth and for a longer time frame than in the energy sector, they were more interested in really vulnerable people, like the mentally or physically disabled, those who are stigmatized, or those who are geographically remote. And as I said, the audience size estimate was a lot higher than what we thought originally. We also found that the COVID-19 impact on the hard to reach was massive, particularly on those largest audience groups, the most vulnerable, the lower income renters, small businesses, particularly those who were forced to work from home, those who were laid off, of course, those with childcaring responsibilities. Women were particularly hard hit. There was massive differences in race and ethnicity, and key essential workers also were usually more likely to be people of color on lower income, who were of course exposed to a lot more risk than the white middle class. And we also identified some big research gaps that we really need to focus on more, some of which we're going to discuss now. So I really want to again bring home that these audiences are not just hard to reach, they're underserved and under-researched. There are underlying structural systemic issues around energy justice, inequity, and particularly stigma that I think that are absolute key themes that we're just not yet willing to really address, because it kind of feels like as energy efficiency professionals, this is outside of our remit. But saying this is all a systemic thing, I don't think there is such a thing as being able to stay away from these hard topics. And finally, I just want to give a very quick shout out for our work program now. We are doing a cross-country case study comparison. We would really like to invite more countries and case studies from on the hard to reach, such as pilots. I've come across a couple here at Behave, and I've already contacted them, and hopefully we'll get them. But if you have anything or know of anyone, please put us in touch. And also we're looking to fund and undertake field research pilots. So I'm just going to check if there are any questions. There's a couple of things in the chat, hopefully not that nobody could hear what I was saying. Yeah, no, Louise, that's just Louise giving instructions. Does anyone have any questions or feedback or comments? Because just jump on, get yourself off mute, turn your video on, talk to us. Love to see you and hear what you think. Chiara.
Yeah, I'll jump in, even though I kind of know this one. I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about what's coming up in year 2, because I know you flew through it and said we're undertaking case studies now, but yeah. Yes,
of course. Thank you, Danielle. Oh, I just saw Simone here. Ciao, Simone. Sorry, it's one of our ex-club members and a good friend. Good to see you. So the cross-country case study comparison is going to be basically individual country chapters and case study analyses in each of the participating countries, but also some other contributing countries like the Netherlands. I'm hoping maybe Italy, hopefully Portugal, Canada, and the UK, of course, where we are collecting 1 or 2, maybe 3, but at least 1 case study, preferably in the residential sector around, yes, income as a denominator, but we would like to have an intersectionality with another vulnerability, such as gender or race or immigration status or non-English speaking, whatever, any such vulnerabilities that intersect with them that were studied in field research pilots or small programs are of interest. And then we're also interested if there is such a thing, which is very hard, as I said, they're very rare in the commercial sector, particularly around SMEs, small, medium businesses. We are also going to publish our ABCDE research process. It's in the works right now. There's a whole lot of people from around the world co-authoring that. And then we are still working on getting those field research pilots funded in our countries, which is of course always hard to find co-funding for actually doing the work in the field, especially now where a lot of countries are still suffering from COVID lockdowns, etc. And yeah, dissemination, obviously the Behave conference was probably our biggest dissemination yet. I think you've heard a lot, particularly from me, so I may just carry on and give the floor to my colleagues or anyone else who may have questions or want to say something right now.
Yeah, I would just have a question. As I'm involved, and a lot of my colleagues are involved in behavior change interventions around energy reduction, for example, and it's often that we reach out for voluntary participants, and it's very much pragmatic who is involved, but we sort of still assume that we're getting what we sort of thought was that 70% of, and the 30% was the hard to reach, but we were still kind of getting the 70%. And now you've sort of flipped that picture that maybe we're getting actually only the 30% of the people that are easy to reach, and then even within that, the people that are interested and motivated and have time. And so, and just if you have had some further thoughts about the implications for some of these works that have been going on for a long time, or these sort of standard ways of getting people to be involved, what are some of the first thoughts that you've had on this?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Devon. That's a good question. Yeah, so I was quite shocked when I always thought it was a really large number of energy users just from the research I've done around the world in the last 10 years. But I was quite shocked when I saw just how large it was and how big the gaps actually were in the research still, particularly on some of those groups that we all agree are, you know, some of the hardest to reach, like SMEs or renters and landlords or highly vulnerable households, where vulnerabilities compound, and the more they compound, the harder to reach they become. So if you're just looking at low income and you're just targeting them with low income programs, or you're just identifying them by low income metrics, you are very likely not actually targeting those who are falling through the cracks. So one of the things that we all agree on, and that the literature suggests as well, is like you do need to identify your allies, your stakeholders, and other behavior changes that can help you. Don't try and solve this in a silo. You will not be able to achieve as much as if you work in collaboration with particularly behavior changes in the community, trusted middle actors in those communities, people who speak the language, who actually understand any kind of cultural issues that are often also came up, particularly with some of the people of color or immigrant communities, refugees, indigenous communities, and that often leads to mistrust. And obviously, once you lose trust, which a lot of authorities have, there's a lot of mistrust in governments, there's a lot of mistrust in utilities. Researchers seem to be in kind of an ivory tower. And so once you have mistrust, it's very hard to build it from scratch. And so I think one of the biggest things that I think we made a mistake in energy efficiency and why it's such a market failure is that, from my perspective, it's been too white, too middle class, too male, too engineering, too economics, too technology focused, and hasn't done enough to actually listen and understand those who are none of these things, which is the majority of energy users in this world. And so I think it's time for us to actually do some listening and actually find those connections with those other stakeholders who are doing the work in the communities, but who may not be energy efficiency professionals. Anyone else? Or I might jump to Danielle and get her to start up her presentation, which we're nutting more into these issues, don't worry. This is only the beginning.
Furiously scribbling notes, Leslie, because there's like so many examples flying into my head as you're talking through them. So hopefully I'll be able to capture through a few as I'm talking. Okay, so yeah, super. So I'm not Professor Amy Ambrose, but I'm Danielle Butler. I work alongside Amy quite closely. Earlier in C's slide around some of the organisations involved in the Annex is the Fuel Poverty Research Network, and I'm one of the trustees in that alongside Amy, and working with C and colleagues also in the Hard to Reach project today. And so I'm going to take one of the first sort of knotty problems that's come out of this big literature review, so kind of reflecting on some of the bits around the beast, but more specifically, I'm going to talk around the trouble with terminology. And I think, I'm not sure how many are in the room, and I think I saw 20 plus sort of when I joined. I think we kind of all maybe have encountered similar sorts of problems, whether you're a researcher or working in policy or practice on the front line. And often that tricky part can be around building a definition that's neat enough to be proactive and to be able to get stuff done and action to take forward on an issue, but not in a way which excludes or treats a certain group as homogenous, and then kind of, you know, introduces a whole set of problems beyond that. And I know that in my background working across housing and energy poverty and all sorts of issues like this, wherever we're dealing with some complex social problems, we need a definition. But getting there can be quite tricky, and I think this is probably the biggest finding from the literature review, and hence sort of C saying earlier that really important about having this broad definition that we can start with before we go into the design and deploy stage of the project. I'm hoping that's going to change the slide. Not yet. Any joy from your end, C? Still on the first slide?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've pushed 3 buttons now, so I'm worried it's going to jump like.
I can maybe we'll
Okay,
try. Oh no, here we are.
Yeah, it's only wanting me to do it with the mouse and the arrows, so that's fine. Cool. So reflecting on some of the bits from the lit review that is forthcoming, the beast, as C referred to it, and I think you've given another presentation on it in the conference, so some people may have heard some parts of this. And yeah, and kind of relating to that, like I said, to draw out some of the key examples, UK centric, so I apologise, it's where I'm based, it's where I've worked for a number of years, but sort of actively in the last year with the FPRN work and with the Hard to Reach now, sort of trying to branch out to understand that beyond my own geographical silo, I guess, and that closed box. But yeah, so thinking around much of the lit review that we've covered in the beast, I'm just going to stick with that. I really love the reference of it. I think it needs a title change nicely. So thinking this around, so coming kind of back, hard to reach is a terminology. It's not exclusive to the domain of energy poverty or even energy scholarship more broadly. I mean, it's been used in a lot of disciplinary and practice spaces. So some of the dominant areas are around health and social services. And this is across all 4 of the countries, if I'm right, but any sort of member of the team, do feel free to jump in. I've got a couple of frozen people on my screen, but I can see Louise moving. Can you hear me okay? Is it others that are frozen, Louise? Okay. Yeah, so in terms of disciplinary areas, so a lot of stuff around how do we best reach people, or how do we design policy and practice that best reaches people in health and social services, also in education. Some of the sort of interesting ones around social media and employment and sports studies. And many of these have there are some overlapping commonalities with the literature in the energy space. So things around gender and age, which we'll talk about a little bit more, hopefully, as we go through the rest of the session. And then also in sort of the non-energy literature, a lot around hard to reach groups that might be represented by families and parents and otherwise recognised vulnerable populations. And we recognise that the term vulnerable in itself is also sticky, much like hard to reach. So this, as C sort of touched on already, can include minorities. For example, other examples in the literature were those formerly incarcerated, those with experience of homelessness, immigrants and refugees, and sex workers, among other interesting examples in the literature. Within the energy space, oh, it's working now. Within the energy space, so within energy literature and practice, again, touching on what C said, low income features, and that's sort of a dominant focus, and I'll come back to that as sort of a criticism as well. But within energy research, this sort of idea of otherwise vulnerable, or particularly within sort of the European context, this emergent literature around energy vulnerability, which offers sort of a more fluid and flexible way of understanding fuel and energy poverty that isn't sort of fixated around this binary understanding, which often we see in policy, if policy exists at a national level, where you are either fuel poor or not fuel poor, energy poor or not energy poor. So certain concepts around vulnerability, particularly energy vulnerability, allow us to understand that shifting and changing. So some of these sort of groups, again, appearing in the energy literature to a much lesser degree, and this might be partly related sort of, again, to what C said around a technical focus, an economic focus, less work being done in the social science domain, although I guess where you live and breathe it every day, like myself, it feels there's actually quite a lot of us there. But when you kind of go into wider spaces and particularly doing big literature reviews like this, you realise that the field is quite small. So one particular study, Sovacool's study, looking at the disciplinary base across energy scholarship, sort of situates social science at around 12% of that, and much of this with a qualitative insight, again, which I'll touch on in a second, around interviews and understanding the experiences of those who have direct experience of the issue, is even smaller representation across the literature. So returning to sort of how hard to reach is understood in this space. Those who might be classified or defined as energy poor or fuel poor in particular country settings. Again, those mentally or physically disabled, people of colour, from Indigenous communities, immigrants, those who are sitting at the extremes in terms of age, so the very young and the very old, and those who are geographically remote. Now, in terms of hard to reach work in the UK setting, a really good example of a project that I was involved in a few years ago looked at the Outer Hebrides, so the 4 small islands that are connected on the northwest, off the northwest coast of mainland Scotland. And again, sort of worked with, and this might be something that comes up in the discussion around understanding maybe hard to reach actors who are in the middle, so those between the communities and the households that we might be trying to support or protect, and the people making decisions and design and interventions. And in this case, that drew on the health sector and understanding the role of GPs and other local health actors like COPD nurses to reach out to those communities, in this case geographically sort of rural and remote communities. No, now it wants. For this sort of the remaining couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about and ask for some audience participation in a second, and we'll get logged on to Mentimeter and have a go. We're going to focus sort of on the residential space, but I guess if people in the discussion want to bring up some of their expertise and experience around the commercial sectors, that would be great. But thinking around some of those hard to reach groups within the residential area, and again, so touching on some of what C had said around renters and low income households, but many of those other groups that may not be as represented to date. So part of the beast, the latter part of the beast involves reporting on the findings of a gap analysis in the literature and bringing that all together to understand where those gaps exist. And so the vast majority, as C's already sort of explained to us, it does focus on low income and low income households, but particularly again within the UK context, we know that low income doesn't necessarily mean hard to reach. It also doesn't necessarily mean vulnerable. So taking the example of fuel poverty in the UK, we understand that some of our lowest income households live in social housing, for example, yet social housing by far now doesn't perform the worst in terms of energy efficiency. So if we're understanding that from an energy poverty point of view or a fuel poverty point of view, those households may not be defined or classified as living in fuel poverty, and so may get missed off some of these metrics and not necessarily classed as hard to reach. There's also lots of discussions around social housing often being participating in sort of area-based approaches or sort of mildly at the risk of being sort of guinea pigs in various studies, and so not necessarily being hard to reach because there's less decision making around the properties. In the UK, and I'm sure this is the case for many other countries now, it's actually the private rented sector. So when we talk about the most vulnerable renters or the most difficult to reach or provide support to, that's sort of the context in which we're looking at. And in a decade in the UK, our private rented sector doubled. And so working through landlords and also places like estate agents make those households particularly hard to support and hard to reach. And as C mentioned, within the literature review, high income has been sort of almost exclusively or entirely overlooked to date. There is some emerging work coming out more recently, but it's still a particularly key area. Limited focus on geography and an interesting intersectionality. So C had mentioned earlier about compounding vulnerabilities and understanding that in the context of hard to reach and who is the most vulnerable. Non-native or non-English speakers or non-native from particular different countries. And all of this culminating to the biggest gaps in terms of demographic data around gender, race and age, and how we might better understand and design and approach these particular demographic set. A really interesting thing so my background is in psychology, so I was really interested to come on board and work as part of the project to understand another major sort of gap in the hard to reach literature at the moment around the use and strength in understanding psychographics in the area. And whether or not this presents a major opportunity in better understanding what hard to reach means in the domain of energy. I think my dogs are just starting to make noises in the background, so I might be the first feature of pets in the day, apologies. So thinking around psychographics, this is sort of understanding attitudes, behaviours, relations, lifestyles, and a bit more tapping into this, the idea around lived experience and direct experience of a phenomena and how well represented that experience and that voice is in our ways of understanding the issues and how we approach them. So it's largely based today on assumptions. So there's a huge opportunity to better include and better access data to tap into what psychographics mean for this area and how we might understand them better. And as I said there at the bottom, the biggest gaps being listening to the actual audiences and understanding their needs and how best we meet those needs. A particular area of interest to me, and again an emerging area in the literature, particularly again in the UK context, is around social relations and understanding the role that strong or absent social relations play in connecting people. Today, it's sort of we've in policy, particularly again in the UK context, there's been a lot of coverage of how we understand isolation or understand the connected dots between people, like again, as C mentioned before, third sectors and trusted partners within the communities, but less so how they present an opportunity and how that might be capitalised on. There's a lot of reference to trusted sources of support, but we often don't know what we mean by that or break that down or problematize it. And how, again, linking to what will come from Kim shortly after me around what that means for mistrust, building trust, sustaining trust. So just sort of drawing some of those major criticisms out before I stop my talking and hand over to you guys. Drawing some of those together. So there's a failure to acknowledge the spatial heterogeneity. So I think I mentioned at the start around the problem when we're pulling these groups as one and how we balance that, the risk of working with a workable definition between sort of honouring and acknowledging heterogeneity throughout it, whether that's in terms of spatial, but also other issues around sort of within groups. No two private renters are the same. And so understanding the mechanisms and challenges that are faced there. And again, poor diversity in terms of designing schemes and interventions. So we've had a very dominant focus by a very dominant group of people who have been involved in designing and delivery. White man in, white man out, but also I think beyond that in terms of disciplinary focus, so thinking around things like to what extent rational behavioral models are involved. So even when we come down to some of the psychographic stuff, some of that has been dominated by behavioral psychology, rather than sort of thinking in terms of maybe critical social studies and critical social psychology. A dominant focus on low income, and often low income being understood as problematic, people on low incomes as needing to have behaviours changed. A really common example of this in the UK literature is around budgeting and understanding how we, a lot of work might be how we can help households budget better or manage their money better, whereas actually they represent some of the most savvy people in terms of managing household finances, and simply don't need help there. It's help in many other domains, like accessing cheaper energy bills, or being able to make their energy go further in terms of providing better efficiency in properties. And so as I've mentioned in the last slide, sort of thinking beyond demographic data and approaches, and how we might think differently about the data that we hold and the approaches that we take. Accounting for compounding vulnerabilities is definitely an area that needs more attention, and then thinking again, linking to sort of C's initial argument around the bigger issues and the bigger picture. So thinking around things like structural systemic racism. I'm now going to be the test on Mentimeter, so hopefully everybody has their a web browser open and they are able to go to the website. Is Louise or C, are you able to put your camera on just so I can get nods that people are looking like they're in the right place?
The code is correct, Danielle. So if you want me, I can start sharing my screen. So then we can go to the first question and we can immediately see the outcomes online.
That would be fantastic. Thank you. So I'll stop sharing now.
Mm-hmm.
Hang on, you may need, do you have the questions, Louise, on your screen?
Yes. Give me just
You're
1
way
second.
more organized than, okay, I'll be quiet. You're way more organized.
Thank you.
So, so now that is the welcome page that everybody should see, and I will move into the first question. If you just give me
maybe if we could just 1 second, Louise, before we go
Yes.
through. Is there anybody who who's not in our group who can just give us like a thumbs up or a yes, they're in the chat? Are we in, Menti? Oh, I've got likes. I'm assuming those likes mean people are in, Louise.
excellent.
Let's
Yes, I can see at least like 8 or 9 people already.
Wow. Yeah, there's love hearts across the screen.
Excellent. So, okay, so I will start with the first question.
Super.
And then hopefully everybody can see the respective options. If not, just make sure that you refresh your screen or your web browser, and the questions should pop up automatically. And then when you are done, please submit your answers, of course.
This is where we should have had music, or
I don't have any music, any background music. Maybe C can share something with us.
some singing.
Well, the first answers are coming up now. So Danielle, I leave obviously to you and the audience to discuss what you actually can see in real time.
Brilliant. So
Also, you really don't want to hear me sing, trust me.
if somebody has any instruments, I have one of the 2 dogs on the floor next to my feet will start singing, which is also painful to him.
Oh, these are interesting.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just I need to remember to speak to you all instead of just getting lost in this. So social network is a particularly interesting area to me, actually, again, relating to the idea of social relations and understanding. So in research I'd worked on, understanding where relationships are good and sort of where they strengthen the opportunities and where they weaken them. And so there's been quite a bit done around social network analysis and some really cool stuff done with qualitative approaches in terms of this. number of concurrent jobs, and I see actually that's something we might want to come back to in the COVID section, because this is one of the things in data around having a number of jobs at any one time. And we know that that rampantly increased in the UK context as a result of austerity in the last 10 years, but COVID has sort of shot that up even further. And we have lots of issues.
Yeah, I like the family size one too. That's a good one.
Wow, there's loads in here. Grid operators, so demographic data around that, regulation, refugee status. Some of the other experts, country experts, might be able to speak better to this, but this isn't very well understood in the UK context at all, and particularly there's a real dearth of research in terms of race and ethnicity and around migration status. This is particularly troubling considering sort of we're at 3 decades now, I guess, of having data pools and data samples in this area. So the demographics around that and research work related to it is fairly minimal.
Yeah, I think we need to crack on. Just but we will actually, we'll try and capture who was here, and we will capture all of this, and we'd like to send it around as like maybe a slide deck later or something with like the minutes from this talk.
Yeah, so the next
workshop.
Yeah, the next question should be fairly quicker and easier for us to work through, because the main difference is now how we understand psychographics. So what data do we need to better understand the psychographics of hard to reach energy users? I'm actually going to join in on this one, I think. Does anybody want to offer any reflections on the energy past relationship? I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Whoever put that on, if you want to talk to that, that would be great.
Yeah. So the energy history stuff and biographies is a really brilliant way of tapping into norms and okay. So the supply,
like the mental health, hygiene.
Super.
Kurt, was it you, the energy past relationship? So the connection to tradition, upbringing, is that what you mean with that?
Great. Yeah, so again, sort of talking to the work in the Outer Hebrides and the rural communities in Scotland, and that was a really big thing around peat cutting and using peat to heat, and the tradition of families coming together at a certain time of year, and that transition to other sort of energy sources was particularly difficult. Yeah, Louise, I think we've got a fair bit there now if we move on and open up the discussions for others. Okay, so we're going to go to the third and final question now, which again, so this time, who should be collecting this data? Which actors do we need to be checking in with? Actors, institutions, organisations? Did you put hygiene, Kurt, and washing machine going on, laundry practices?
Physical hygiene.
So feel very free to put the, if we've got known actors and known institutions that we're working with at the moment, it doesn't necessarily need to be reinventing the wheel, I guess. Whoa. Faith groups, yeah, a number of so in my role now at National Energy Action, I'm no longer in the university, sort of connections with faith groups at local level has been fundamental to sort of a number of the projects that I've worked on. NGOs, transdisciplinary. Everyone, I really like everyone.
That was me, sorry.
Energy manager. Brilliant. I am conscious that I've definitely stolen 5 minutes of Kim, well, of the rest of the session. So C, feel very free to move us along if you'd like.
Sure. Yeah, thank you, Danielle. This is great. Also, thank you everyone so much for putting in these great terms. There are definitely some that are I haven't thought about or I haven't come across in the literature. So this is brilliant and gives us more good stuff to think about when we are, you know, doing our work going forward. So it's much appreciated, and thank you, Danielle, for jumping in for Amy and doing such a great job as well. Kim, do you want to take over and talk about barriers?
Sorry, can I mention something very briefly?
Of course.
If people can stay with their browser open, because there will be more questions and we will continue using exactly the same Mentimeter. So please keep it open because more questions will come. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. All right. Where is Kim?
I'm here. Sorry, I'm just trying to work out how to share my screen and not one of the very many web browser windows that I have open with my collection of tabs to be read.
I had to force quit my Chrome because I had like 100 tabs open and my internet started freaking out. So yeah.
Yeah, I've got to say I'm not sure how much longer my internet is going to cope with the number of to be read tabs I currently have going on. And you will excuse the terrible energy pun, but I'm quite pleased that you went a little over, Danielle, because I'm finding my own personal energy is a little hard to reach right now, quite late at night. So I am going to be talking a little bit about the barriers for engaging with hard to reach energy users. Let's see if I can advance this. So first of all, just back to some of the major findings around the definition. And Danielle mentioned this, that we kind of talk about hard to reach, the term being quite commonly used both inside and outside of the energy sector. And that can be a bit of a challenge. So another thing I think is that we are really conscious that we need to take particular care to keep value judgments out of the perspective of hard to reach energy audiences. So when we're trying to engage with them, that we want no element of victim blaming involved in this, because otherwise we can run up into these trust issues in particular. And something that I've found that I just wanted to mention, I think, is that when I've talked to people and I've said, well, is it useful to have a label for whatever group that we're engaging with? I do a lot of work around energy poverty. So, you know, is it useful to call it energy poverty or to have a name for whatever this particular issue that makes these people hard to reach? And so, yes, having hard to reach as a label is useful, because if we don't have that, then it's quite difficult to kind of grapple with the problem. But at the same time, that label hard to reach can actually act as a barrier in itself. So yeah, I think there's some kind of tensions around the labels that we use and what we mean, and being clear about what the definition of that label is, which I think, yeah, we've tried to keep that very broad for a number of reasons that we've explained in this project, but that does come with it some trade-offs as well. So just being aware of that up front. Whoops. So if we just head through some of the barriers that we find from the characterization that C talked about on behalf of our colleague Kira, that really highlighted some of these important barriers that people are facing when they're trying to engage with hard to reach groups. And I mean, a lot of these barriers, there's nothing particularly groundbreaking here. I don't think it's a collection of barriers that I think we're all relatively familiar with if we've been engaging in this area for a while. See, highlighted before this, competing life priorities being a big one, particularly now with COVID. I think there's really been thrown into stark relief here. And actually a lot of these problems and these overlapping problems and barriers are going to be quite even more of a challenge than they were previously. So we are keen to get some feedback on how you think that we should be dealing with this, and what kind of insights you might be able to offer as far as where this project should go in the post-COVID, as he said, possibly post-COVID space. Yeah. So moving through to some of the key findings from year one, the literature review that we've undertaken. So as C and Danielle have alluded to, the beast was rather larger than anticipated at first. And so it was broken down into various chapters looking at each of the barriers. Was one subset that we looked at in each of these different groups. So I'm just going to talk through some of these, and I'm not going to go into huge detail on all of the barriers for all of the groups. I'll just highlight some of them. So for the vulnerable households, if we look at some of the, I guess, more prominent barriers that come up, I think, are the ways around which we try and pay for energy. So looking at neoliberalism as a kind of overarching energy efficiency policy and how well that works or does not work for people, whether they are engaging with paying for electricity by prepayment, which can be a barrier to engaging with people. On the flip side, I think also that we could say for high income households that having a direct debit going out of your bank account can also be a barrier as well if you are in the category of household that doesn't need to worry about what is going to go out of your account. So there is some contrast between the vulnerable and high income households here. We also have a lot of problems, I think, still where we are ignoring the co-benefits of energy efficiency in our cost benefit analysis, which makes it hard for us to, I guess, address what the value of engaging with these vulnerable households is all of the time. And I think another thing that we should mention when we're talking about vulnerable households is sometimes the intervention design just doesn't fit with the household. For example, if we've got time of use pricing as some kind of intervention, but we've got a vulnerable household with a family who's working on shift work who just can't actually shift their energy use at all, then some of those kind of interventions just doesn't really work. And C talked about structural inequalities and racism, the issues of engaging with people of colour and migrant communities when we're not actually thinking about designing interventions that fit with them or take their views into account. That can be a real challenge as well. I talked briefly about high income households, but so sometimes the price mechanisms are inadequate because high incomes are less sensitive to price increases, and their perception of disposable income, if it's kind of irrelevant for them to be actively engaging with the energy use in the first place, then that can be a real challenge. And we do see from the literature too that there is has been highlighted a negative correlation between income and reducing energy use as well. If we move on to looking at landlords and tenants, again, a lot of this, I think we're quite familiar with the ideas around split incentives and the principal agent problem, you know, who is the, when the service user is not the one that's paying for the investment, or when the person who's paying for the investment is not the one who's going to be, I guess, benefiting, as it were, from reduced cost of energy, then that can be particularly difficult. Again, with lack of evaluation of the co-benefits, that can be quite a challenge in the landlord and tenant sector as well. I'm going to try and move through. Sorry, this is not clicking through very well. There we are. So I think some of the things that I wanted to highlight around the commercial sector were this one around the tragedy of the commons, the kind of idea that the cost of workplace energy is often of very little relevance to the workers, and therefore they're unmotivated to reduce their energy consumption. And also this idea of focusing, whether we're focusing on human behaviors or if we're focusing on technological solutions, and where there is a significant mismatch of what these issues around that are, or significant tensions between those two things. I'm just thinking personally of my office, which is usually incredibly cold, and we have a number of plug-in heaters that we then feel quite happy about turning on. So those kind of things can be a real challenge to overcome. And there are a lot of kind of common barriers that we see between the commercial sector and small to medium enterprises as well, and along with the landlords and tenants. But small, medium enterprises often have more limited resources. They have less time, less money, there are less personnel there. There are fewer people that can engage with energy efficiency literacy. They're also more diverse and often have more kind of mistrust of different utility programs. Another challenge is that they may have remote decision makers, or I'm thinking in terms of different franchises or something like that, where sometimes the decisions are made quite far removed from where the energy use is actually happening. So some of those factors become quite important too when we're thinking about barriers to engagement there. So in summary then, if we just have a look here, so I think that the most important, the most commonly mentioned barriers that we've highlighted from the hard to reach literature across all audiences, the competing priorities, the financial considerations. Mistrust was a really huge one, although this wasn't so often talked about in the literature as it was by the interviews and the characterization that C talked about before. When we're thinking through also about market failures, for example, the split incentives and the informational barriers between those that are using energy and those that are making decisions about energy efficiency investments as well. I think it's also important to highlight that a lot more focus in the literature is spent on describing the barriers to engagement than the actual needs of hard to reach energy users. And very few papers seem to actively undertake needs assessment to, when they're collecting and analysing information on a particular target population, and then using the analysis to create kind of energy behaviour profiles and make an action plan for engaging with that audience. That is kind of a missing hole in the literature at the moment. I think that's something that we've found. So I'm going to hand you over to the completely capable Louise, if you can help with this again. Louise, we'll head back over to Menti and have a bit more of a discussion. I'm just going to give you a brief preview of what the questions will be from me. So we'd like to know what the top 3 barriers to engaging with your hard to reach audience of interest have been. So if you could just enter 3 words or topics into the word cloud there. We'd like to know, have you encountered mistrust as a major barrier in your research, given this is something that was really coming through quite strongly in the interviews, but hasn't been quite so well explored in the literature to date. So we'd like to know about that. And we would also like to know, how can or should, can you or should other behaviour changes gain and maintain trust of your hard to reach energy users? How does that happen? That one's open-ended, so you can go for gold. Thanks very much, Louise.
Yes, you're welcome. I will now start sharing my screen. Our answers are coming up, or coming in, I should say. Just if you give me 1 second here, right. So now everybody should be able, hopefully, to see my screen with the live results.
Yes.
I can. I hope others can.
Ooh, too many chefs. I like that commercial sector, especially in the food sector, which funnily enough is actually the one that uses the most energy, which most people don't know, because most research focuses on offices. But it's actually the food and healthcare sector that use the most energy in the commercial sector. Oh yeah, this is good. I think what we can see is there's quite a bit of issues around the behavior changes, not just again the audiences, which I like, because it puts the onus on us, not just them. So these ideas of top-down decision making or unclear responsibilities, communication, of course, the too many chefs, cultural misunderstanding, access to the group. Yeah, these are which networks to find. These are issues that, you know, are more on our onus rather than the hard to reach energy users. Kim, is there anything that you pick up that's
No, I agree. I really like that because, like I said before, I think we're always keen to avoid the idea of victim blaming that can kind of come across in this hard to reach, with this hard to reach label that we're using here. I mean, often, for example, if we go back to the energy poor, they're often actually not that hard to reach. They're engaging with a whole lot of social agencies and on a very regular basis. We've got plenty of opportunities to reach them. We're just somehow not doing that. So that's not on them, that's definitely on us. So I think that coming through quite strongly in this red cloud here is great. It's it means we're hopefully at least here we're speaking the same language.
And I like the lack of common language, because that is really important.
Should I move to the next question,
yeah.
Kim?
Thanks, Louise.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So now hopefully everybody can see the next question on his or her respective screen.
Yeah, so I wonder, does anybody who's shared here, does anybody want to jump on to the microphone and just elaborate on that? If anybody's feeling chatty,
tell us some stories.
Please tell us some stories.
Hello, I can share a small story maybe from Portugal.
Thank
Great.
you.
I did a study on small business at neighborhood scale. So you have the grocery shops, you have hair salons, those kinds of small business that often have less than 5-10 employees. And I found that they are very far from these discussions on energy. They have to run their business, and it's difficult to run a small business and to keep it alive. And they see the big energy utilities as very suspicious. If a utility goes to them and says, I can help you reduce your energy bills, they know there's always a catch that may put their business at risk. So I think it's this sector is very, very distrustful of help unless it's given for free or by someone they know at the neighborhood scale or within their network of small businesses.
Thank you, Miguel. Anyone else want to share some stories with us? I'm interested that we have a couple of people that have said that they haven't encountered mistrust in their research as an audience barrier. And I just wanted to ask if one of you wanted to share kind of how you might have been trusted, or yeah, what's the flip side?
What did you do better?
How
Oh
can we learn
yes,
from
Miguel.
you?
Miguel,
Thank you, Miguel.
I'm gonna chase you as well to see if we can't get Portugal into the case study analysis. That's okay. Yeah. One thing I think I've learned by encountering, well, at the very least, mistrust due to cultural misunderstandings is never make the mistake to think that because you're talking to one or a few members of one specific, ethnicity or group, that they will speak for everyone else. That's a good way of getting yourself in trouble.
Should I move to the next question, Kim or C?
Yes,
Yes,
thank
please.
you, Louise. I think we better keep moving or we're leaving no
Yes.
time.
Okay, sure. So hopefully now everybody has the next question on the screen.
Yeah, I think this this issue around proof of privacy can be a really important one. And I think for me, sometimes because I work in the academic sector in New Zealand, at least we're seen as quite independent. So that is a useful way that I can engage and I guess help to bridge that knowledge gap sometimes. So I don't know if that's something that others have found. I think we also find definitely in New Zealand that having trusted middle actors is really critical for us, having good engagement, particularly with low income and vulnerable people. Thank you very much for sharing with us. There's some really useful stuff in here, and yeah, we hope to engage with you more. I'm sure C will be chasing you all down.
If I can find you, I will. Although there's something about not sharing your private data. So yes, we will share our contact details to hopefully be able to engage with anyone who's working in this field and wants to engage more. Us three ladies have been a little bit too chatty, and we've kind of really gone into Louise's time. I blame me more than anyone for that, also for the terrible timekeeping. Louise has very kindly agreed to give us the last 15 minutes to not go into transaction costs, but instead to have a bit of a chat together about what we think is going to happen in a hopefully post-COVID world to these hard to reach energy users. And I'd just like to highlight again what we saw in the literature review, even in the data only up to September, it was shocking, the inequality and inequity that was highlighted even more with the pandemic, the infection statistics, the death statistics, the unemployment statistics. In New Zealand, for example, where we had only 26 deaths, and we're one of the countries that did the best. Of the 10,000 people who lost their jobs following the lockdown, 90% were women, for example. This is something that has been repeated in other countries, because women, of course, are the ones who are more likely to take on the child caring responsibilities, maybe more likely to be single parents. And then when the kids, have to stay home, they basically have to give up their employment. They're also more likely to be key essential workers, particularly women of color and low-income women. These groups that were already hit really hard by energy injustice, energy unaffordability, energy insecurity, have through COVID often been put in really untenable positions. And obviously in the US, they were looking at, before the government changed, at 40 million evictions, and obviously the homeless aren't not energy users. They also need energy. They also need access to energy. Only 5% of the homeless are actually living on the street. Most of them are transitory, and so there is a lot more of them. And I can't see it that we are having a global discussion, or even in our countries, a solid discussion about what happens to these people. And another group that we're not really talking about so much is what happens to those who were high income or middle income users, but who were vulnerable poor, in the sense that they may be asset rich, but they are living from paycheck to paycheck, which a lot of people are in the Western world. And so COVID suddenly has taken it away, and they found themselves immediately thrown into much greater vulnerability than they ever were before, and having to deal with the social welfare system and stigma that is involved in it. And of course, in the US, with the healthcare system as well. And I'm seeing there okay, some questions, but so these are some of the issues that I have certainly seen crop up a lot. I've seen them being mentioned in like news articles and stuff. I know there is a little bit of research starting on it, but I just really wanted to hear what any of you thought about this, what this would do to this new world that we're starting with, and particularly as behavior changes, we're now seeing that behavior change was hugely important in helping with the pandemic, and also what the limitations of individual behavior change are when it comes to, political influences or the wider systemic issues. So I think, Louise, do we have another couple of questions on?
Yes,
one question at least.
I just posted the first question about the COVID, so hopefully everybody should be able to see it now.
I see the transaction cost one.
Aha, okay. So
is that, hang on, I think you need to I need to go to slide, right? If you may need to go to slide when you change it. Yes, now I see it. You may need to just refresh your browser.
Yes, please do so. Thank you.
And yeah, so we'd like you to write an open-ended answer, and then maybe jump on the chat and turn on your video so we can have a bit of a discussion about it. Especially any of you who have worked on COVID impacts on vulnerable or hard to reach energy users.
I can start sharing my screen because results are coming in.
Great, thanks, Louise. And apologies again for talking through your...
No problem at all. Absolutely no problem. So that is the live result interface. So hopefully everybody can see it.
Yeah, I agree. The hard to reach will be the last to come out of the pandemic situation. Vaccine apartheid is definitely something that we're looking at across the globe, and it's just gonna not make the pandemic go away. It's very short-sighted of rich nations. The focus on comfort, that's a larger abandonment. Do you mean like a social abandonment? Anyone who wrote that, maybe you can elaborate in the chat or jump on.
Because
Yeah.
I wrote that because I think you have two ways of looking at this, the positive and the negative. And in the positive way, we focus more on comfort, or we try to provide closer support. But on the negative sides, maybe for conflicting time and attention, that was the next person, maybe hard to reach become even more difficult to reach.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we're already seeing that. And I think I mean I also wrote about the middle class becoming permanently vulnerable, and suddenly that group is becoming so big that those who have been vulnerable for the longest and who are maybe the most vulnerable are getting crowded out by this new group of, you know, previously wealthy energy users suddenly finding themselves in those dilemmas and not knowing how to deal with them. Children, unemployed, elderly, yeah, also the rich who benefited a lot from the pandemic. I see that at least twice. That is a really good point, and at least 3 times there. I agree that is a big issue. What does it mean to those, especially seeing we don't have to research in terms of not just benefiting from it, but also increasing their energy use, their greenhouse gases. You know, now they're all wanting to relocate to Mars, for crying out loud. All these billionaires. New Zealand bunkers aren't enough. It's just, yeah. How we build our homes, that's a very good point in the bottom there. Rather than open floor apartments, and the same with the office, that's a really good point. I've actually heard that a couple of times, not just that office buildings. So the office sector is already over-researched and actually much lower in energy use than the other commercial sectors that we're not focusing on, which are hard to reach. But obviously, there is going to be a lot less, I think, commercial office space, and a lot of the commercial office space that was open plan may not be, you know, may need to be retrofitted. And I think the work around social relations and loneliness and the mental health implications of lockdowns and stuff, I think they say more around things like co-housing and this idea around better urban development, where there is more ways of utilizing shared spaces safely. The research that Amy did on the lived experiences of the most fuel poor in the UK was that they really suffered in the lockdowns because the homes were so cold and they couldn't go into those shared spaces. They didn't feel safe, where they could get warm in the past. Yeah, using COVID experiences as a reflection for referencing behavior change. I think that's a really good point, particularly for us behavioral scientists. I know that at least some of our work in some countries has been misused, and it has actually caused a lot of excess deaths. In the UK, as an example, was the whole idea of behavioral fatigue, and thus not going into the strict lockdowns when they actually would have made a big difference. And I just read a paper that actually made estimates, and it was tens of thousands of excess deaths that could have been avoided. Commuting, less commuting is obviously a plus, and working from home. Louise, can we go up again a bit? Some really, really good points here. Autonomous, possibly affordable energy services. Yep. Raising awareness among the rich. The rich came up a lot here, which I think is actually a really good point and something that we shouldn't ignore. I'm just gonna, Louise, did you get enough time to get us into a ranking, or was that?
Yes, absolutely. Give me
We'll
2
do-
seconds, please.
Yeah, I would like it. You guys have been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all these like really interesting points. Louise has done a great job on the fly, taking some of them and distilling them out. And we'd just like to finish off with getting you to rank some of those top points for us. So we can maybe take that forward and actually, you know, provided us some feedback to our behavior changes in government, especially. So that's the last question we'll ask you to answer. Oops.
Sadly, I think that last question does it come up? Do we need to refresh our screen for those of us that aren't seeing?
Yes, please, you have to refresh your,
okay.
But now on my admin page, I can see that most participants should have the question.
I'm really impressed with how well Mentimeter works.
Yeah, the internet gods are with us today.
No, as I say that, it actually says there was an issue connecting to the Mentimeter server. Please try again. Literally as soon as I said it.
See, you've got to know that you can't say these things out loud.
I know.
Just not wise.
Never tempt the internet gods. God, how our gods have changed, haven't they? Yes, okay. I'm glad we see that we all agree. The more focus on the vulnerable and inequity especially, and I'm hoping that also means the structural underlying issues for that is super important. Working together with social services, absolutely. And obviously one of the issues there is that we need to understand that they have their own competing priorities, and energy efficiency isn't the #1 topic. So we need to make way for that and explain the co-benefits to them. And then addressing the new groups, including the rich, I think is a really, really, really good point that I'm glad came through so strongly. And I also realized that we are at time, and I think we may get kicked out. And so I just want to say so much big, huge thank you to our presenters, to Louise, to every one of you who have engaged so incredibly well with us. I hope this was an interesting session for you. And if you want to hear me rant about a bit more about equity and stuff like that, I will give the closing plenary very soon. So have a good lunch, and you'll see me at midnight New Zealand time with a glass of wine in my hand. And thank you mostly to Louise for giving up his time for us chatty ladies and for running the Mentimeter so well.
No problem at all. In case if somebody wants to get the results by the end of the survey, you should get like a question from Mentimeter. Just put your email there and you will get the results of this survey of our session.
Great. Thank you. And I'll hopefully see you soon at the closing plenary.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Good night.